be lucky to have them here this evening because most of the time you'd either find them at an airport or you'd find them traveling down the Nile or sitting on top of Matthew Picchu, and it's very difficult to find or get a hold of us. I think a lot of us during the years when we needed him couldn't find him. You'd never know where he was. 10 days later he might show up. So indeed we're privileged to have Arthur Erickson here this evening. Now, normally I don't like to give long introductions, and I won't, but I thought for those who haven't read Mr. Erickson's background, I just briefly, very quickly want to go over it. Mr. Erickson graduated from McGill University in 1950 with honors, received the Lieutenant Governor's Bronze Medal, a Plain Traveling Scholarship, and the Pilkington Glass Second Prize. And when I saw Second Prize, oh my goodness, I never knew Arthur to get anything except First Prize, but anyway, we have a second here. Was assistant professor at the University of Oregon from 55 to 56. Then he taught at the University of British Columbia, where he became an associate professor in 1961. Received the Canada Council Fellowship for Further Architectural Research in the Orient in 1961. The partnership renewed with Mr. Massey in August 1963 on receiving the first prize in the competition of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia, which I think a lot of you have seen publications on that. He was awarded the Pan-Pacific Citation of the American Institute of Architects, the Hawaiian chapter, for outstanding contributions in the field of design. The recipient of the 1967 Molson Prize, and Molson is one of the large breweries in Canada, awarded by the Canada Council for the Arts. With the firm of Erickson Massey has received numerous awards and houses larger projects, which I'm sure all of you have seen publications on, including first prize in a national competition design of the Canadian Pavilion at Expo 70 in Osaka. And he was, the last item here is winner of the 1971, certainly wasn't all the right ones. This is the Royal Bank of Canada Award for outstanding contributions to human welfare and the common good. And that is an award that's given to any outstanding citizen in all of Canada. So I don't know where Arthur goes from here because I can't think of too many awards left in Canada. So this evening I'd like us all to welcome Arthur Erickson. Thank you. Extremely interesting to us and presumably, I guess, to other people. I'd like to very briefly talk a little bit generally about our approach and then specifically to show you our work really right from some of the early houses up to some of the more recent work. Some of it, as I say, I think the quality is very uneven.
this was, but that whether he was referring to the book he had written, or it was sort of rather mysterious, rather esoteric at the time. But I think it has proven to be one of the most important admonitions for me, and I think one that all of us in North America really need to become more and more and more aware of. The question of relationship, that architecture is basically the art of relationships. All art is concerned with relationship, there's no question about it. But the area of architecture covers such a vast section dealing with the physical aspects of the environment, the relationships that occur within the environment, whether it's the natural or the urban environment of the building, the relationships within the context of the building itself, the relationships of this to the community, the social relationships, the whole question of simple communication, which sets off another series of relationships. We can't underestimate the importance of buildings as meaning, because whatever we do, it means something. And whether we do it carelessly or whether we do it well or whatever we do, there is a meaning that because the minute a statement is made, the minute a gesture is made, it becomes symbolic thereafter. And the problem in North America, I think, is that, and I think this is part of the problem with our cities today, and I think we're all very much concerned with the quality, what is happening in our cities, that the way the continent was settled in the first place, I think one has to project oneself back to the first people that came to this continent and found that in order to make anything grow at all, there was a great wilderness that had to be conquered. There, to make a clearing in the forest, you had to deal with animals, you had to deal with savages, you had to fight for that right to grow the food on which to subsist. And therefore, a very important and at the same time a very faithful significance occurred, which has colored our civilization ever since. And that was that nature was the enemy. And basically, I think the North American culture is one of the few cultures which hates nature. Now, we say that we like it, and we try to get out into the wilderness to enjoy nature, but basically, underneath, it is a hostile element which we have been trying to defeat right from the beginning. We've been trying to bring under control. And this has colored our civilization. It's colored the way we have dealt with land traditionally. Our attitude has been destructive. We haven't been cultivators. We have been destroyers. We invented the large machines which could clear land as easily and as quickly as possible. And at the same time, the attitude towards nature is no different than the attitude towards the city. The hostility that was engendered early dealing with the homestead came into the small town, came into the village, came into the city, asserted itself as a kind of competitiveness within the fabric of the city itself, to such an extent that there are very few instances in the whole of this continent where there is an attempt to bring the elements of the city together, where there's an attempt to relate the parts of the city. And we have gone through, and I hope we've gone through and finished with, that era when we were building proud and of it is that a building is only what it appears in context. And everything takes its meaning in context. Nothing has any meaning in isolation. Therefore, you can't take something and extract it and say, look, this is a beautiful object. You can only say, look, this works for what it is supposed to do in that context. And it is the context that we have to begin to find in our city. So I think this is one extremely important factor, and I think you see everywhere signs of an emerging consciousness of what is happening in the environment, what is happening in the surroundings, how to treat these things with a certain amount of tenderness and a certain amount of humility, because this is the only way we are going to begin to cope with the environment, and it's the only way we're going to be able to begin to cope with the city. Unfortunately, we don't like our cities, and the history, again, of North America is one of escaping from the city. You know, the commune is the oldest traditional form of escape in North America. And we've been doing it right from the beginning, and that's why our cities are as bad as they are. We've never faced them. We've never tried to cope with them. We've never learned to enjoy the city, to really begin to love the city as we think we love the land. And it's only when that occurs that we're going to be able to begin to build cities that are worth living in. And building cities is just nothing more than everyone's attitude above it. You know, nobody comes along and plans a city. Cities grow, and they're just as independent of human will as plants are independent of human will. I find that with my experience, one of the things that I've been most curious about and made the greatest effort towards, John intimated, is finding out about other parts of the world, finding out about other cultures, how what the mindset of other peoples, other cultures are, and this is an extremely difficult thing to comprehend. I think I'd like to illustrate this by a story of one of my experiences in Japan. When I went to Japan in 1961, I spoke a little Japanese. I'd been speaking the language in the army. I thought I knew Japan. I read all the books I could. I knew all the architecture, or so I thought. And when I went to Japan, I found that all the things that I'd seen in those illustrations just didn't exist. That everything that I expected to see, I didn't find. And I was very perplexed because there were beautiful illustrations. I'm sure you know some of the books with the very beautiful Mondrianette compositions, the size of tea houses in Japan. And these, you couldn't find them. You could, if you looked and you explored, you began to think, oh, where did that person take this photograph? And then I began to realize that everything that I had been looking at had been taken by a Westerner, a Western photographer. And what I was seeing was not Japan, but Japan through Western eyes. And the Japan that I saw was very strange and very perplexing and very aggravating, because I've been used to buildings of Europe, which are very yet there's something there that is extremely fascinating. And when I was a month in Japan, I visited a garden, a very famous garden called the Moss Garden, which I'm sure you know. And in it was a small tea house, which is supposed to be one of the most famous tea houses in Japan. And this tea house absolutely aggravated the hell out of me because it seemed precious, it seemed cute, it seemed contrived, and I couldn't understand why it was considered to be one of the top examples by the Japanese of tea house architecture. And one day I was visiting a shop that a friend of mine had who was a European, and he had two cases, one of Chinese porcelain and another of Japanese pottery. And the Chinese porcelain was very pure, very geometric, the forms were very clear. The Japanese pottery looked as if the potters had perhaps tried to do that, but then either the kiln had fallen over, fallen in, or the wheel had collapsed, or something had gone wrong. And to me, it seemed to be a kind of precious thwarting of the real accomplishment of the idea, such as the Chinese porcelain had. So I said to this friend, I said, to me the Chinese porcelain, I can understand it, it speaks to me, but what about the Japanese? And he said, you don't know anything about it. He said, this pottery is just as great in its way as the Chinese porcelain. And he said, you just haven't been looking. Well, I was crushed because I thought I had been looking. And I determined that the next day I was going to go back to this garden where the tea house was, and I wouldn't leave that garden until I really understood that tea house. I thought it was one of the most magnificent buildings in Japan, and until I convinced myself. I got up very early that morning and went to the garden, and I went to the tea house and still looked so artificial, I couldn't see it. And I walked around the garden. I sat there most of the morning, and it was a beautiful morning. And finally around lunchtime, I think that hunger or physical need is probably one of the greatest spurs of inspiration there is. I began to think, now how can I keep my vow and not leave this garden, but still get a sandwich or something to eat? Or how can I enjoy this tea house? And I was sitting at the end of the lake in a little shelter when suddenly I heard a rush, like a whole flock of birds coming through the trees. But it wasn't birds. It was a group of about 20 women gardeners, and they were all in their special costumes and their hats. And they were pruning the trees. Only the difference was that instead of having long scissors on poles and saws and things like that, they had nail clippers. And the largest instrument they had was the size of a nail clipper. And what they were doing was taking each cluster of needles of the pine trees and trimming the ends. And they released that cluster, and it was a perfect cluster of pine needles. And they were also pinching occasionally a leaf of the maple tree. But the amazing thing was that this garden, which looked as if nobody had touched it, it's one of the oldest gardens in Japan. It looked as if nobody had touched it when I came. After they'd been through, it was as if a wind had gone through the trees and drummed every unnecessary leaf, and only the leaves that were absolutely essential were left. And it was more beautiful than it had been before. So I was so astonished by this. I thought, well, in the West, it would be impossible for us to trim a tree this way. I mean, we'd have to lop off a branch, and then it would be asymmetrical. We'd lop off another, and our whole approach to it would be pretty brutal. We couldn't pinch leaves or trim needles. And I began to think about the Western tradition, where really the human form has been the basic aesthetic basis for architecture. And this becomes a terribly important factor when you're in Japan. Because in Japanese art, the human form doesn't exist. There's a little bit of portraiture, there's a little bit of human figure drawing, but it is the natural form of the tree, the rock, the grass, that is important and has been the basis of their art. And therefore, this was the basis of their aesthetic judgment as well. Now, this has an amazing consequence, because you begin to see that a human form has strength, it has muscularity, it has vigor, it has all the attributes of physical health, but not a natural form. A natural form doesn't have strength. It has grace, it has a marvelous flow of growth, because the branch in a series of branching sort of reaches out into infinity, and there's a kind of rhythm which goes on and on into infinity. And this was the type of thing that the Japanese buildings were talking about. I went back to this tea house after that, and the whole thing made sense. Because what they were concerned about was not placing a building on the earth and building something which had a physical presence, but they were concerned about a gesture that was almost like a tentative rooting of a tree in the earth and its branching out. And the rhythms that occurred in this little tea house, and the way the beams, the columns, the spaces moved to a kind of infinity was absolutely remarkable. So this was a revelation of another way of thinking, of another way of judging. And I'm only saying this because, to a certain extent, I find I'm questioning my own work, my own judgment, because I know there are so many other bases of making these judgments. But I won't keep you any longer. I think we start with the slides. Is it possible to turn those three lights out? Or? Well, the early houses, one of the concerns that I'd like to talk about with respect to relationships is, of course, the natural side. And I think my whole background is really with houses. I really did nothing but houses for many years, and then the next thing was a whole university. So I think that really the house is one of the most difficult buildings. It is also probably the best training ground. I think from a house you can move to anything else if you understand the aspects of scale and relationship and complexity that exists in a simple building. One is that the site should be better with the building on it than without. And I found this in the Mediterranean, that particularly the towns that have been settled really probably in the early Roman, sometimes even in the Greek times, the siting of the towns, the siting of the villages, in the Greek times, the siting of the temples, actually made the site itself much better for the building. And I think that that is a kind of goal one should try to achieve in the siting of a structure. This is a house on the edge of the cliff, which is the one on the far right that you could see in the previous slide. There was no land left to sit on or walk on because it's really a cliffside, and therefore all the roofs became the decks that you walk down over. And the house was put, I usually try to put the house on the worst part of the site, not on the best part of the site. But leave the best part as it is. And try to find with the building other experiences of the site than existed or were obvious before you started the building. Actually, this is right under a cliff face and is built on a rock scree. And it's a very, very simple composition of overhanging beams and rough wood. And stairs that come right under the overhanging cliff. And as you come into it, you really don't see the sea, except gradually. The sea which is really the subject of the whole house, because at the end it overhangs the sea. The sea is only revealed to you bit by bit as you go down through the house. It's a kind of discovery of the sea. And in fact, I think perhaps in a strange and remote way, this was influenced by the Villa d'Este in Tivoli. In the garden, you seem to go through the noise of the turbulent waves of the sea, and then through the turbulence that's under the waves, and then at the very bottom of the garden, the deep, quiet pools of the depths of the sea. They seem to have interpreted that experience of the sea in the garden itself. So as you come down, you begin to get glimpses out into the sea. And finally, looking back at the house, it rests over water itself, and the water, part of the house seems to be a kind of bridge over a pool that extends right through the house to the other side. Another house which had quite a different experience. It was laid in forest, and therefore it was surrounded by trees and was a kind of involuted house. It didn't look out to anything. There were glimpses of the sea at certain points, but basically it really looked at the forest on all sides. And the house is built very, very simply out of one size of beam, and that size of beam is both the beams, the posts, everything. And every finish in the house is the same. It's all a leaf-treated fir. Floors are that, the cupboards are that, everything. So there's only basically one material in the house, plus a bit of concrete. And it's a painter's house, and so the studio floor is a vinyl tile for the sake of cleanliness. The courtyard and the whole house actually is a pattern of beams stepping up as you go around the courtyard, one beam lapping over the other, so that from the entrance you rise in a spiral up to the bedroom you see at the back here, and then from the bedroom you can walk up on the roof of the garage, and from the roof of the kitchen, and the roof of the living room, and the roof of the bedroom. So it's an endless spiral. This is from the entrance looking into the entrance courtyard. And you can see how to the right he begins to step up, and then beyond in the living room he steps up again. So it's just a very simple composition of overlapping beams and sheer sheets of glass. It's a very, very small house. And this is the living room itself. And the studio, which had to be a very separate kind of space for reasons of light and for reasons of color, the neutral background for the paintings. Now from that to the university, I can't figure out whether you're focusing or I am. This was a composition that, it was a competition, I should say, and the idea of the competition was to choose 5 architects to build 5 traditional buildings in the university. And I really having spent a lot of time in universities teaching and everything else, I didn't like them. I felt that really the university was a very artificial place, that buildings for, well, building buildings for architecture, building buildings for forestry, building others for chemistry. It seemed to be a very strange idea that each faculty should have a building, because it had nothing to do with knowledge. It had nothing to do with the fact that one should be able to experience all of these things and not go into a special enclosure for each discipline. And as a matter of fact, I think that idea promotes one of our intellectual problems, and that is that we do separate things. We do think of things as different disciplines, when really they are not different disciplines. All of these things overlap and have a great deal of interrelationship. So the attempt here was to try to build a single complex, in a sense a single building, in which all of the various disciplines would be merged. There wouldn't be any single building for any particular discipline. And the site of the campus is on the top of a small mountain, and it acts as a bridge between the two prominences of the mountain. At the far end is the academic part, and what you see stepping down the hill are the various science laboratories connected with bridges, things like that. In the center is what is called the academic quadrangle, which is an enormous sort of area for classrooms, seminars, offices, libraries, small libraries, things like that. To the north of that is the social science laboratories and that kind of space. The spine then extends between, if you go to the left, the library, which is a tall building, the theaters below it, beyond the gymnasium, the Union building, and the residences at this far end. And the idea was that the buildings would be taken apart and used as building blocks to build spaces which are common spaces for everyone on the campus. And this is the approach up the mountain with the academic quadrangle at the top and the laboratories beginning to step down on the left. This is an old slide, unfortunately, therefore a lot has happened since then. And the entrance to the university, where there was an information booth and then the bus stop, and to the right, the theater, because it was built on a mountain top, instead of putting tall buildings, it seemed more appropriate to terrace the land and terrace the buildings as well, so that there was a common compositional method used throughout everything. So there was some kind of harmony between building and between site. And this is the entrance where you come up under a lantern. And around the lantern is the student government offices, and the university divides to the left of this slide the gymnasium residence areas, and to the right into the academic areas. You go up these steps to, well, this is the eye, the lantern over that space. And you continue up the steps to the mall at the top. And the mall is the major covered space in the university with a glass roof over it, because our climate is such that we don't have that severe winters, but we do have an awful lot of rain. And on either side, the library and the theater complex. This is looking into the mall area itself. This is the enormous sort of crossroads of the university, and everybody at the university goes through that space many times a day. The interesting thing about it is that I've had a lot of discussion with students up there, and one of the reactions against it is that it's too contained, that there seems to be no escape from it, that once you're in the area, you have to cope with it. On the other side, they say, but at the same time, whatever is going on at the university, you know about it. And whatever is going on at any area of the university, you know about it. And it is an urban experience. The university has had all kinds of, strikes, sit-ins, everything else, and everything has been resolved extremely well because there is no escaping. You have to resolve. This is at the end of the looking out to the academic quad, and as you come up to the academic quad, looking back into this covered space, the library on the right and the beginning of the theater building on the left, and back further looking down into this space. And then when you come up to the quad, it surrounds a huge garden. And within the garden, there are all kinds of hidden places. There's sort of a mound at one point. There's a deep press area at another, forest grove, things like that. So that you can walk around this quadrangle, and your experience of that garden is constantly changing. And then off the quadrangle are the little tiny streets that wander down between the laboratory buildings. And at every, I think it's at every 100 feet, there's a bridge connecting the laboratory buildings horizontally, and these can expand endlessly. And it doesn't matter really what size, what shape these are. They just continue down the hill and change quite readily with technology, and there's no interruption of the academic process within the university itself. And then on the other side, the social sciences complex, all the roofs are flooded, and I haven't got a photograph of it here, but you can just, well, you really can't see it to the left, but there are courtyards. Courtyards are flooded, and in the flooded courtyards are decks where in the summertime classes are given. And these flooded roofs terrace down, they're almost like rice fields, right down to the edge of the slope, and you look across to the mountains on the other side. So it's really an extraordinarily effective place to hold classes and just get outside. This is looking at it from the end, so that you can see the steps principle on that particular building as well. And that also, this is the married student housing residents, which were also steps down the hill at the far end of the university. So the same principle is applied throughout the whole structure. And at night, because illumination is extremely important, it's almost a positive and negative of a building. Now, a more recent complex, the first phase of which has just been finished, is the University of Lethbridge. It's built in an entirely different terrain. It's the Canadian prairies, which have a very severe climate. They're very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer. They're very stark. They're absolutely flat except where you have a river going through and you have these coulees that finger up into the flat prairie. Traditionally, nobody has built in the coulees. The coulees have somehow or other always felt they were unsafe. And people either build on the top of the prairies or right in the river basin at the bottom. And we found that exploring the coulees and being sort of ignorant Westerners, not knowing that much about the prairies, that really the coulees were absolutely beautiful. That you had both the enjoyment of the flat prairie at one end, you had the enjoyment of the river at the other, and within the coulee itself you had a microclimate. It was much warmer, plants would go there that wouldn't go up on the surface of the prairie. So the master plan of the university was basically to keep all buildings below the flat prairie level, all the major buildings, except certain large spaces such as the gymnasium and the student center, which were to be built on top of the prairie and therefore became earth forms. And this gives you some idea of the building go down into the coulee with the earth form buildings up at the top. This is a very simple concept. In this case, we were trying to, the one thing we found with Simon Fraser was that we were still separating something. We were saying that this is an academic quarter and this is a living quarter. And at Lethbridge, we tried to mix it all up. We said, let everyone live where they are taking classes, and let living quarters be exchangeable with offices, and generally just mix the whole thing up. One of the earlier schemes for this, we were experimenting with the whole question of light and form in the prairie, which is very different from that of the West Coast. And the very stark, strong light of the prairie really determines very small windows and very large, simple surfaces. And however, this experiment proved to be too expensive, and we had to go to the simplest possible contractor-built building to get the space that we needed. And this was the form that was adopted. And the first phase of the university, as you saw in the early model, is just down over the coulees. That's an aerial shot, and you can see it in the wintertime, spanning between the hills of the coulees. But again, the forms are extremely simple. Everything is contained in this building, and it's an inward-looking thing rather than an outward-looking thing, which is very much the life in the prairie. The one thing that opens up is the space for the coulee to flow through, and eventually there'll be a series of lakes behind this, and then setting down to the river, which is down below. And the other thing that we were working with was that the circulation area wouldn't just be circulation area, but also classrooms. And we're working with a kind of furniture which can be used for seminars and things like that, because we felt that there was no reason that one should go into a classroom necessarily, unless you needed special equipment and things like that. But so often, the teaching process is one of discussion, and that should occur out in the open, and it should be in such a way that anyone going by can join in or can happen to participate if they're interested, and that therefore one would pick up the peripheral advantages of participating in this kind of experience, which one can't when it's contained in and shoved into classrooms. This was our first office building. It was a 25-story structure of reinforced concrete. The client was a very sort of down-to-earth lumber company that wanted the simplest and really the starkest kind of structure that we could provide, and therefore we decided to use concrete, poured concrete. I think it's one of the, it was at its time, I think probably one of the taller poured concrete buildings on the continent, and it works structurally as canopy for from the ground, and therefore it is wider at the bottom than it is at the top. It's very thin at the top and very wide at the bottom, because it works as vertical canopy. And the basic grid penetrates the whole building. More recently, and actually in the stages of construction, we started on the head office building for the Bank of Canada in Ottawa. And I'm showing you this because all of our buildings, we first built a model of the city. And we work at that scale to begin with, so we know how the building is going to relate to everything else that's happening. And then we begin to increase the scale of our models, and in this particular case, we are working finally with full-scale mock-ups of the structure and the offices and that sort of thing. The attempt here was to match the scale of the building with the existing scale of the city. The exercise was also to incorporate an old building in the new building. And I'm showing you this not because it's a very distinguished building, but because it was a unique problem, one of trying to match something new with something old. And that area of Ottawa is, the buildings are sort of Victorian Gothic, and they're very faceted, very broken up, and therefore this was part of the reason for this kind of faceted form that we developed for the office building, which was actually a structural tree, a concrete tree cantilevered out from a central column, each of these sections, and with an enormous enclosed space in the center, which of course is occurring quite frequently nowadays, and it is terribly important in Ottawa, which has in the winter really inhuman climate. And this was a later model showing this enclosed central space, and really the same model showing the old building incorporated into the glass wall, the glass courtyard of the new structure. And the possible extension in the future of this enclosed glazed space right across the street into another office development, which would provide a real sort of meeting place in the city of Ottawa, sufficient scale to be used by the entire population. And this is just a fragment of the corner of this particular building. Another project we've been working with recently is a cathedral for the city of Vancouver with an office building. And it's been a very peculiar project, a very difficult one. And one of the most difficult things was the density of the area in which this was being built. And the form of the building came very much from trying to back the building away from the corner of creating a kind of space and linking it with the other buildings that exist in the area. The plan was the property is sloped so that you come into the cathedral at grade, but then the cathedral steps down so that basically the cathedral is underground and the roof is used as an outdoor meeting place in the city. And this happens in one of the busiest corners in the city of Vancouver. And Vancouver does not have really any public space at all, especially an intimate public space. So we propose that the whole roof of the structure become a kind of amphitheater, and it will be heavily planted so that we are screened from the traffic around, and it is an inward-looking space. And this is actually the entrance into this inner space, which works in many levels. You can walk out across bridges, ramps, things like that. And the building itself, in order to dissolve it even further, is a mirrored building. And actually, over the light that comes down in the cathedral is through a glass prism that instead of bringing colored light to colored glass, we're refracting the light through the prism and focusing it down into the cathedral. And of course the building, and I'll show you our experiment in Japan, but the reason for the mirror is because of the changeability. And actually the building in Japan, I think, is probably one of the first mirrored buildings that had been built. So we have a lot of experience with what happens with the sky effects using the mirror. Then, more recently, we've been working on a government building in the city of Vancouver, and this is just the skyline of the city itself. And of course, one of the things that everybody's objecting to, and I think quite rightfully, is the loss of scale in the cities, the growing density that just prevents you from being able to enjoy the streets or enjoy the city at all. And how do you overcome this problem? And our client was the government, who the ways of government is always very strange and mysterious, who felt that instead of necessarily demonstrating how one should build in the city, they felt that they had to appear as the developer. They had to, in a sense, almost be in competition with the developer and get the maximum density and all sorts of things. So we were terribly frustrated by this. We said, well, why don't you, for instance, instead of building on the site itself, build over the street and create, there's all of that land, and you being the government, you can own the street and build over that. Or why don't you buy the property around it and build there and leave the site completely open? Because this also ties in with the principal concert hall of the city, the major radio station, and it could be a place of quite successful public events. Or why don't you build over the whole site and get your maximum density, because usually your floor space ratio is 10 to 12 or something like that, which means that if you build over the whole site, you only have to build 12 stories. If you build a tower, you have to go to 80 stories to get the same density. So we were trying to keep the building low in an attempt to maintain a certain scale. So we said, why not build over the whole site, but lift it off the site, but don't lift it off just a little bit, lift it off about 10 stories. And So we began to experiment with ways of doing this, and these are part of a long, long study that went on for about 6 months, looking at different ways of lifting the building up to provide a high enough space that light and air would get in, and that you wouldn't feel that you're in a dark area, that you would at least be protected from the rain. You only feel that you had an umbrella over your head. And finally, this was the basic premise of the scheme that we're working on at the present time. We have a long way to go, and that was of almost a building system of units from which would be suspended the office floors. They'd be suspended at different heights, so that your space underneath was varying. And where you needed to get your sunlight in at the south, southwest, southeast, you would lift these way up. And to the north, they wouldn't be quite so high. And at the same time, you would maintain a certain scale in the area. And this is looking down onto it, to the suspension system. And of course, these various towers hold all the services for the building, and we're suspending internally. And the roofs also become garden spaces. This is just actually what you're seeing here are the basement floors as well as the upper floors, but it gives some idea of the kind of spaces that could be enjoyed. You can see the scale of a person in this area, and it could provide really major, we were saying the government, instead of being just an office building that should go to, government should be an exhibition area. It should be concerned with everything that's going on in the city, and should make an attempt to provide things which are meaningful for the citizens of the city if they want to find out what's going on. It should also be a place that recreationally is pleasant, has gardens, pools, things like that. And this is the present esquisse of the problem. A few other minor projects that we worked on. One is the Sikh temple. I don't know if you know the Sikhs, but they're the Indians from the Punjab. And the West Coast, we have very many of them. And the interesting thing about this was that after this was under construction, I went to India, and they used identically the same structure that we were using here. So I was able to come back because of a very conservative faction amongst the Sikhs who said, we can't do something as outrageous as that. And I was able to come back and say, well, this is the oldest form of building in India. And that is where you take your square and you cross the corners with this structure. And then you keep doing this. And this you find in all the ancient structures in India, and Nepal, and Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And, I was stupid enough not to realize that I was obeying a very primitive instinct. More recently, we worked on the Paris competition, and were runners-up. And this was for a new gallery in Paris. The competition was to take down the ancient Naal structures, which were these magnificent cast iron structures which were the ancient marketplace of Paris. And we suggested that they shouldn't take them down. They should reuse the areas for different purposes, because not only for the upper areas could they be very pleasant indoor park areas in the winter, but the lower areas, which have had wonderful brick arches on cast iron structure, could be theaters, all kinds of things. used for that at the present time in Paris. And because the block that the building was to be built on was in the center of some very beautiful old hotels in Paris, we said, well, look, we can't in any way match really the beauty of these buildings, so we'll just reflect it. We'll build right out to the edge of the block, which is very much the pattern of Paris. Paris, you're very conscious of the fact that every block is solid, and it's built right up to the edge and right up to the height limit, and of course no longer since they've been breaking through those height limits, but it was really, that geometry was one of the beauties of Paris. So we felt we must maintain that. And what we'll do is turn the gallery inside out and take a street across the center, which will be an open street, and hollow the center out and with various terraces, so that all the galleries look out into this area, which could be used for performance, it could be used for exhibitions and everything like that, and it would be open all night, so that when the gallery was closed, you weren't prohibited from being able to see what was inside. And that diagonal was the main sort of pedestrian route to the subway across the structure. This is a very, very rough model, which was just part of the esquisse. Then another sketch, these are all just sort of recent things we're working on, is a mountain town in the Banff Lake Louise area, which follows very much mountain forms itself, terracing, planted roofs, etc. And an early scheme working with a freeway. This was a housing scheme that was built right on the edge of a major freeway coming from the city of Montreal. And we began to question putting up a series of tall high-rise. It had a major density problem, and we had to go to a considerable height, but we felt that one should be able to walk out of one's floor and be able to walk down the building outside if you wanted to. You didn't have to go down the elevator, because we felt the worst thing about most high-rise buildings are the elevators. These are the things that disorient you completely. And more recently, we were given the task of working on a freeway into Seattle. And the freeway was already given to us, and it was a question of what to do and mean to people. What use can it be put to? And the very elaborate study, which went into all kinds of joint use exploration. One of the more feasible things turned out to be actually a container storage and movement system, because the freeway crossed all the major transportation routes in the port of Seattle. It crossed the major harbor entry, the major trucking routes, the major rail lines. We felt that we just used it to handle cargo and store cargo, and this would make very good sense. Well, this is actually not what is being done because of time. There is a budget allotment for the freeway, and it has to go ahead. It has to go ahead as a freeway. So that was the end of that particular story. In 1967, we were given the assignment of using timber to house one of the theme buildings at Expo 67. This was Man in the Community. And the idea of this was to create an umbrella, a shelter, that seemed to go infinitely vertically and infinitely horizontally. So that when you went into the space, you had the sense of infinite extension, both vertically and horizontally. And that in this infinite space would be a garden. And in the garden would be pavilions ranging from 1 foot in diameter to 20 or 60 feet in diameter. And these pavilions, you would go into them to hear about some of the problems of community in the world. And having gone in, you would be suitably depressed and then come out into this garden, which would be a kind of very, very tranquil space. And then you have enough, you'd be refreshed enough to then face the next little pavilion. And there would be an infinite number of pavilions. I probably, I'm pressing the wrong and this was the garden space in the interior with a very large body of water that also extended out infinitely. Eventually, the problem of providing that many pavilions of that many different sizes became too complex, and they settled on 6 pavilions, which seemed to be a strange choice. However, we didn't have anything to do with it. And at the very center, you could both look down and up vertically, and the space went up right out of sight vertically. And then at night, this was emphasized by the night illumination. And you can see how also horizontally it seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. We wanted to, at the beginning, we were going to put all kinds of strange birds, strange animals, everything else in this garden. But I think we ended up with one parakeet, a couple of swans. Now, the pavilion at Osaka, which was a very different problem, I don't know really how to start on this, except that it was, I was fairly sensitive because of my Japanese experience to what the Japanese would respond to. And I felt it should be a building which, in a sense, was a no building. But at the same time, had something to do with one of the natural elements. And at the same time, would bring something of the West to the East. And of course, one of the also very different factors between East and West is that our architecture is sky architecture, and theirs is earth architecture. The sky is something you don't see in Japan. The buildings are built under the trees, and you very often don't even see the top of the buildings, or you might see the top fragments, but you're very much aware of the earth and the ground patterns and that sort of thing. So I felt, therefore, perhaps they would be interested in the sky. And of course, the sky is very much part of the Canadian landscape, and big, simple forms are very much part of the Canadian landscape. And so the idea of reflection and of tilting the size of the building at 45 degrees so that the building at certain times would disappear altogether was the basic idea. And also because in Japanese architecture there is a kind of ambiguity that you're never sure where something begins or where something ends. That perhaps we could do the same thing with mirrors, and also the whole idea of infinity, which I explained to you earlier, that the building should disappear endlessly into its walls, and so that this became an extremely ambiguous building. It was basically 4 sort of pyramidal. It was basically a pyramid, like truncated pyramid, but scooped out, courtyard in the center, and you came in the 4 corners. began to get reflections of the sky. And the interesting thing about this, which of course you don't anticipate, at least we didn't anticipate, was that it was really a very exciting exposition of what happened in the sky. Because here, for instance, you are seeing the west sky placed against the east sky. And when you look at the sky, it seems to be all more or less one color. But when you begin to juxtapose the two extremities of the sky, of course this could happen because of the four corners at every part of the sky, you began to see the tremendous variety in color and tone of the sky. And the building was always full of these reflections. It was always changing. And of course, it's the idea of change as the only permanent quality is also very much a Japanese idea. And people used to come out whenever there was a sky phenomena just to look at the building and to re-examine that phenomena against itself in this kind of situation. And this was the entrance. Actually, in the lower, you see the Japanese katakana for Canada, and it reflected also the fairgrounds around. And it took all the other buildings and sort of took them apart and rearranged them in this way. So there's this kaleidoscopic effect. And this is the courtyard. This is really just before the building was finished. And in the center of the courtyard were 5 columns. And here you really see the effect of ambiguity, because the columns were mirrored too. And it's very difficult to find out, it was very difficult to find out, which was the column and which was the real space of the building. And at night, again, these reflections and the laminated beams supporting the building disappeared to it on all sides. And this was the Japanese umbrella phenomenon, which was something else again. And the columns supported spinners, and these spinners moved very, very, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, but fast enough that you're always aware of a change in the composition of the pattern. And again, this is carrying the idea of change. These are actually spinners no, it's not acrylic. It's it's very flexible, clear plastic. And you can see the patterns reflected on the columns themselves, and also the pattern of the spinner above moving through. And it was a tremendously voluptuous experience. And then this was just in the evening as the lights began to come on the top of the spinners, and where all the spinners overlapped, rotating very, very slowly. And then again in the evening, just how the pavilion changed with the different qualities of light. And at night, of course, it disappeared entirely except for the reflecting the fairgrounds itself. You just had these vertical walls showing the fairgrounds, and if it was a very black night, the rest of the building disappeared completely. Well, I thought that was a good end on as the beginning of mirrored buildings. And I thank you very much for your patience. to cover your roof with something, and I feel very, very strongly that your roof is probably the most important part of your building now, and we usually ignore it. Planting the roof is terribly expensive. Flooding it does two things. It provides a reflective surface, and it also, and this we can do in our climate. You might not, well, you should be able to do it here, certainly. But it also provides the both insulation in the winter and reflection in the heat in summer. Also, it's terribly attractive, you know, to be out in a series of ponds that especially is facing an outlook which can be reflected in the water. I say that, you know, I think that so often, for instance, on the Osaka Pavilion, when you're working on something, you really don't know what you're doing or why you're doing it. You know, I think you're obeying an intelligence which is not a conscious intelligence. And my feeling is that the less you think about something, in many cases, the better it is. If you can rely upon experience as such, if you can, I think the most important thing is your observation in training your experience. And then that all goes into your sort of non-conscious intelligence. It goes into something which is automatic, unconscious, and quite deep, and something that you can draw on all the time. I think that you find, what I find amusing is that when you've done something, you realize that there were reasons for doing it, but you didn't know what the reasons were at that time. That you are being informed by that other level of unconsciousness. And I think also, you know, one of the, I think we have this notion of the creative act, which is quite fallacious in the Western world. We think of ourselves being creators. This is part of our religion. Everything else is part of our myth. Whereas I find much more attractive, and think myself really, that we are more perceivers, and that really all we're doing is observing and distilling that observation that isn't something that is being made, it isn't something that is new, it's always there, and all that you're doing is distilling out of what exists something which is a little bit clearer and more vivid and more meaningful. No. I'd love to be, but we're not. I think you're always influenced. I was influenced by Wright. I was influenced by Corbusier. I was influenced by my experience as a mountain climber when I was much younger. You know, really what you apply in your work is basically your life. go through a process of just exercise, looking at a thing from many different angles, attitudes, approaches as possible, but not coming ever to any conclusion or letting even have an opinion to form until, gradually the pressure, because these things begin to overlap and build up a certain direction, which is so strong that you can't resist. But the more exhaustive you can be in your examination of something in every aspect, the better it is. It's really trying to know something as fully as possible without forming opinions. I think the one way to kill something is to have an opinion about it. And you begin censoring before you begin receiving. Do I have to be frank about that? I think it gives you, every experience, whatever it is important. I found when I was at university, we were veterans, and we sort of took over the school that we wanted. And however, I learned a great deal because I'd never been exposed to architecture before, and I really learned from those people that I had a fairly intimate contact with. Of course, I think this is the thing, to really come in contact and be stimulated by other people, and you can certainly get that at the university. It's from those around you, from those in your faculty, and this sort of thing. But I've never believed in, quite frankly, in courses, things like that. I mean, I think, again, it's a way, it's a process. And I'm not sure about, I don't know what you do now in architectural school. So I can't say anything about that. But the important thing is to, it seems to me, any opportunity